Hello again. Thank you for coming back, caffeinated, sugar-fed. I remain Peter Goodman, global economic correspondent for the New York Times. I am wrapping up a book about the great supply chain disruption that is provisionally called How the World Ran Out of Everything. So this particular panel is near and dear to my heart, the evolution of the supply chain. We've obviously been through some incredible shocks. One could argue, as people have already, that the pandemic just exposed pitfalls that were there before, an excess reliance on just-in-time or lean, whatever buzzword you like, that turned into a kind of crude imperative to slash inventory and hand the proceeds to the shareholder, long supply chains, reliance on shipping, which didn't work out so well during the worst of the pandemic. And so there's a lot of talk now that we no longer live in a just-in-time world. Now the new buzzword is just-in-case. Lots of talk about resilience in the supply chain. I will put my bias as a moderator on the table at the beginning of this conversation. There's been a lot of this time is different through history. I first wrote about a supply chain disruption in 1999 when there was an earthquake in Taiwan that knocked out semiconductor fabs there. There were a lot of shortages of electronics for months after. People said many of the same things. Oh, we need more resilience. We can't just concentrate so much production in one place. Fukushima, of course, famously, massive shortages of electronics, great disruption to the global economy, lots of promises, less of a reliance on long supply chains, more of a look at resilience. And then the world got back to normal because we live in a supply chain that's been built by the investor class for the benefit of the investor class. It's worked out very, very well. It's worked out well for consumers in many respects until sometimes it doesn't. So now we're having a much more sustained, comprehensive conversation about resilience, and to discuss whether this time is going to work out much like these other events I've just related, or whether this time really is different and we're going to see change. We've got a couple of terrific experts. Jan Godsell is Dean of the School of Business and Economics and Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Strategy at Loughborough University in the UK. Her work focuses on the pursuit of more responsible consumption and production through the alignment of product, marketing, and supply chain strategy with consumer needs. Elsa Olivetti, on the end, is the Esther and Harold E. Edgerton Professor in Materials Science and Engineering. She also co-directs the MIT Climate and Sustainability Consortium and received the 2021 MIT Bose Award for Excellence in Teaching.
There you go.
That is phenomenal.
Throw that in there.
So I ask both of you, and Jan, we can start with you. I mean, both of you work closely with companies on issues around sustainability. So for the purposes of this conversation, we can look at evolution in terms of sustainability. To what extent are these goals, whether you want to talk about a circular economy, whatever form of sustainability you favor, to what extent is this a sort of aspirational conversation versus things that companies are really doing in changing the way they manage their supply chains? What are you seeing?
Okay, so I come from the UK.
Indeed.
And I have been surprised today by the lack of discussion of the S word, because the S word is probably sustainability, or the achievement of net zero is really, really critical to what, maybe based on some of what's been said earlier, the lack of an explicit industrial strategy, but some of the ways where the UK government put their dosh. And so in the UK, firms very much are focused, say you're a manufacturer, you're really driven to look at your Scope 1 emissions. And by looking at your Scope 1 emissions, that's the sort of sustainability within your organisation. And in order to do that, essentially, if you can set up your operations, people have talked about things like flow. I'm going to say if you can use the lean philosophy, the lean principles, not the I think you described it
the pre-McKinsey version.
Yeah, the real version of lean. In terms of a philosophy, that means that you've understood demand and put buffers in the right place and created flow. If you do that really, really well, then actually you should be as productive as you can be, which means you're as sustainable as you can be. And then if you focus on your Scope 1 emissions, so you then industrially decarbonize so that you use low energy drives and use the things to be as water efficient. For your current configuration of that factory, that's great. But then we also focus on what we call the Scope 2 and the Scope 3 emissions. And then you've got to look at the supply chain. So there's a lot of initiatives in the UK that would be around what we call industrial decarbonisation. Classically, it's focused on the big industrial clusters. So I used to work for, you've got to be old to know who ICI are, but they're a vertically integrated organisation. The only thing that they didn't do themselves was paint work when I worked there. But those sorts of industrial clusters that exist, there's new projects around how you would use different types of energy, not just electric energy, there's a lot around hydrogen and things like that to enable industrial decarbonisation. But I was involved in a very interesting project that was looking at, could you use low carbon energy to reindustrialise? So the Black Country in the West Midlands came about through coal, and it produces a lot of metal-based products. That sort of business has fallen away. And our project I was involved with was, if you could introduce low carbon energy, could you use that to help to reindustrialise? But the second element that comes into it too, which again, it was really great to see the last presentation, because it's the first time I've heard circular economy mentioned. The UK is investing a lot into the circular economy, because the reality is we don't have anything. You know, beneath our ground, there's nothing. Someone mentioned fishing this morning. We're even running out of fish because we think the French have taken them all. So we don't have a lot. So when we look to the future, and if we want to be resilient, we might need to look into what we've already got. So we actually think that the future may mean we've got to decouple consumption from production. Each and every one of us, if we really believe in sustainability, we need to buy less stuff. You know, we need to buy less stuff, and then the stuff we've got, we need to keep it in its highest possible value state for as long as possible. And that's going to redefine manufacturing, because actually maybe the role that the UK plays in the future isn't primary manufacturing of new stuff. We're going to be really decarbonised, and then we use those facilities to repair, to refurbish, to remanufacture, to redistribute. And maybe that's how we redefine our role in the global manufacturing ecosystem.
But do we see this actually happening, or are these the talking points about what would be great to see happen?
No, we're beginning to actually see this.
So, like, what are some examples of what you're talking about?
So, the UK government has invested £30 million in 5 circular economy centres. I'm involved in one, it's called Circular Metals. And we work with organisations, so I'm working with organisations like Tata Steel to look at how we could achieve full metal circularity by 2050. I ran another workshop, so some of my other work through a project called Interact, that's also government funded, but that's more about the digitalisation of manufacturing. We're looking at, we took a region, the West Midlands. I don't know how big it is. Everything in America is huge. I think all of the UK could fit into some of your states. So the West Midlands is, I don't know, probably about the size of one of your cities, but it's one of our biggest industrial areas. It's where our automotive industry, I suppose a bit like Detroit, and has had the same fate as Detroit. But we ran a workshop there, and it's actually multi-stakeholder, included insurance, finance, people like Jaguar Land Rover, people that make batteries, because what we wanted to look at is how could we redefine the West Midlands as the heart of an ecosystem for electric vehicles. But interestingly, none of the business models they were coming up with were about forward-facing manufacture. We still really struggled to know whether we'd ever make cells in the UK. You know, at best, we might assemble batteries. But the energy in that group, and that group of people wanted to stay together, because this is the other thing we realised, that going forward, the answer doesn't sit within any one firm. Thatcham were there. Thatcham in Europe, they do all of the testing of cars, you know, the crash testing, they give them their NCAP rating. And they were saying that the biggest issue we have in the UK at the moment is that the average life of a car until it's written off by an insurance company is 5 years. What do you think the average life of an electric vehicle is till it's written off? Insurance write-off. Anyone? Less than 6 months.
Wow.
Because the minute it's involved in a collision, we can't say how safe the battery is, and so therefore we have to write it off. And they actually think that the cost of insurance could become a major inhibitor. The lady from Thatcham told me she'd never buy an electric vehicle, she's going to wait for hydrogen. So we've got these great ideas, but the systems haven't caught up. So actually, and we then tie that into thinking that in the future, we might not even own cars. The average car is only used for 6% of the time. The rest of the time, it's sat there not being used. We have these, I don't know if you have the same in the US, where we lease our cars. 75% of people now lease a new car. They don't buy it. But that means that every 3 years, you're changing your car. That's more material out the ground. So we're thinking that our solutions, and actually again the West Midlands Combined Authority, their transport divisions, put a lot of effort into this idea of mobility as a service. So imagine you get up in the morning, your phone's synced, a car picks you up, takes you to the train station, your train takes you there just at time, you take your train, you get to the other end, there's a bus there just at the right time, and everything's perfect. That there's a thought that actually car ownership could be a thing of the past, and then if car ownership is a thing of the past, then actually the way that we manufacture our cars would be different, because the way that we repair and service them would be different. So yeah, maybe we've been taking too many drugs in the UK, but we are thinking about it a little bit differently.
But enough about Brexit.
Yeah.
Elsa, similar question to you. Do you see evidence of the supply chain changing in terms of the sustainability issues that you're really focused on in the US or anywhere for that matter?
Yes, no, there's so much to unpack in what you offered. Thank you so much. It's so refreshing. So I'll try to offer a couple thoughts in what I feel like. So let me just say, we have a long way to go, and it's unclear if we have time to get there, given what the long way to go. But there are ways in which, since I've been working on this topic, I see there start to be more accountability, and we were talking a little bit about incentives and things than there maybe used to be, and accountability in a couple of ways, and I'll try to ground it in some examples. And I was also loved the way we started the day and talking about delocalization and controls at the border, and so I think there are some real positives in terms of that, and what that means for sustainability and what that means for accountability, but there are also some real challenges, and that's kind of pervaded the day. But we also haven't said the word sustainability very often, so I'll try to kind of say a few words in light of that. So in terms of accountability, one thing I've seen, and I work with a couple of different consortia of companies in a couple of different ways. So one is with electronics manufacturers on looking at streamlined methods of understanding the footprint of their products. And that effort started about a decade ago, and it was very much then about kind of putting a number on a product and understanding how do consumers then make choices about that. Now it's about the companies being able to demonstrate they've made progress on their net zero goals, right? So that they're using that footprinting as a way of benchmarking. And so they have increased interest in making sure that those data are available to understand what is the manufacturing footprint, energy use of a fab, right? We've talked about that. And so, so that makes them reach up their supply chain. And so this accountability coupled to goals, the stated net zero goals, but also this need for visibility, understanding, transparency. And I think that's another shift that I've seen. We all get to talk about material supply chains a lot more, right? Anytime I open the newspaper, there's something else talking about, laterite mining of nickel, which is not something you used to read about in the New York Times. So I think there's a sort of visibility, accountability, transparency need that I think is interesting that could be made stronger by controls at the border in terms of there needing to be more data in transactions. So I think that as a potential opportunity. One of the challenges I see in delocalization is a bit what you said. There's so much need for collaboration and coordination. And we talked about earlier in the day, small and medium-sized companies working with larger companies to have, I think we were talking about it in terms of apprenticeships, right? Because there's so much resource that needs to go into solving these challenges, and they have to be done in a global, collaborative way. And that we've seen in spades in the Climate and Sustainability Consortium of these big companies, Apple, PepsiCo, Cargill, Dow. They want to work together. They want to convene at a table with the experts at MIT to develop solutions that they can co-invest in, that they can reduce risk by working together financially. And so I think that I see as a potential challenge of the ability to share best practices, to the extent that we become more protectionist, more reserved, more insular, I guess, as a real potential threat for that, getting to what Suzanne talked in the beginning of the day about a real transformation and evolution rather than just extension and expansion. So those are just a couple thoughts. Maybe one more thing I'll say on this, because you ended in this, well, there's so much in what you said, but so one challenge that we see is the degree to which we would have to shift business models in order to get to the sort of product as service. I mean, that's something that's been talked about for as long as I've been in this space. And so we talk about workforce training, the depth that needs to happen for example, Holcim, which makes cement, is another member of the Climate and Sustainability Consortium, for them to move to concrete and cement as service, right? Everyone within that organization needs to be retrained, from the guy who does the IP agreements with universities to, the sales people. And so just the degree of transformation is quite astounding.
To what extent are the financial incentives that are governing, especially publicly traded companies, where the CEO cashes a bonus check for boosting this quarter's numbers? Boosting return on assets is a metric that's very popular. Not so popular is, I spent a huge amount of money to make us more sustainable so that 10 years from now, when the sea level really rises, someone will look back and say, good job, guy who's no longer here because he or she has been replaced by some other CEO. I mean, to what extent is that a real tension in terms of preventing the sorts of changes that you are both advocating?
I think it's the number one issue. So about 10 years ago, I wrote a paper that was called Fudging the Supply Chain to Hit the Number, 7 things that financial analysts should know. Because years ago, I did a case study where essentially this would be, I was going to say FTSE, but it was on your
New York Stock Exchange,
yeah,
NASDAQ, take your pick.
Yeah. So this is a huge electronics provider, and essentially they'd had huge inventory write-offs back in the early 2000s, and so they were really scared at seeing their share price devalued again. And essentially, in Europe, what they were doing was they were committing to a sales target, and once they hit it, which they knew they'd hit it before the end of a financial quarter, they stopped shipping the product to their customers. They'd wait 2 weeks, they'd report, and then they'd start shipping. Well, if you were to look at their throughput graph, it would have gone do, nothing, doosh, do. So that was destroying customer value because they had customers waiting 2 weeks, and it's also not delivering at lowest supply chain cost because they've got assets sat for 2 weeks doing nothing, and then they're paying for expedited delivery. So it's not really delivering true shareholder value because they're wasting money, but it gives the impression to the stock market that they're a wonderfully run company. So I actually think, I know we would discuss this before you said education. I would love to go and educate some people in the stock market about how companies really run, and if they wanted to be really smart and know if they were well run, what they should look at. But going forward, I think if we want organizations to actually take, and it's not just the sustainable part, I think sometimes I get a bit sad because we put so much focus now on the environment. Well, what about people? There are so many bad things that happen to people in supply chains. We have big OEMs that rip off small SMEs. We have people that aren't getting paid the true wage. We don't necessarily even pay the true price for products because there's price manipulation that goes on perhaps by our retailers. There's so much bad stuff. We're focused on the environmental stuff. Sometimes I get worried that we always forget about the sort of fairness stuff and the people bit. And so for me, how do we create financial institutes that when they look to value a company, they're valuing that company for what it really is and how it's delivering value to society? And maybe as part of that too, the fact that in a way we're creating a system where by CEOs get paid in share dividends, that in itself is probably a bad mechanism because you're almost incentivizing them to potentially not make decisions that are best for the company in the long run, but potentially they're making decisions that might be best for how they're viewed by the stock market. And I think these are some of the really important things that if we truly want to drive change, we've got to face up to these. Because in the UK, we are so rule-abiding and just believe that we are so committed to the free market economy that we will stay committed to that blindly and just watch everything fall apart around us. But a lot of that is driven by the fact that we've got such a strong financial sector where we did have until that word that you mentioned, in the UK.
Which involved negotiating the first trade agreement that actually added barriers to trade in the history of trade negotiations. But so I want to understand, though, I mean, we've now experienced as a modern society running out of PPE in the midst of a public health catastrophe, not being able to make ventilators, not being able to buy toilet paper, or
we never ran
infant
out of
formula.
toilet paper. That was just panic buying. We absolutely never. In fact, I went on the
My
BBC
Tesco,
News
there
to
was no
talk about
toilet paper.
Yeah, that's because
Yeah.
we really didn't. There was enough toilet paper in the
Fair
system.
enough. A lot of people think that
Ran
they
out of
went to the
toilet
store
paper,
and
yeah.
couldn't buy toilet paper. So, I mean, has this, I mean, to the points that you're both making, has this actually, it's clearly changed the conversation around supply chains and incentives. Has it changed board level behavior? Has it changed executive level behavior? Investments in an evolution of a supply chain?
So we have what if you mean the perceived challenge of toilet paper running out.
I mean, the experience of seeing the supply chain that most of us just took for granted. Most of us don't think about truck drivers and to people working in Amazon warehouses. We accept that, yes, there's a lot of bad treatment, but we click here and the stuff shows up at the door. That broke down. Has that actually altered firm level behavior?
I think it has in an incremental way where we need more revolutionary ways of that happening, I think is partly what the point that you were making before. And I think that there has been increased investment or increased appreciation for the need to know where to invest relative to the uncertainty in this. And I think that's partly why companies are coming and interested in working together more in a pre-competitive way to understand how do we develop certainty and where investments should be directed given that.
And go ahead. Sorry.
So I think we conflict during COVID two different types of supply chain flexibility that we need. So take toilet paper, joking aside. Toilet paper is a consumer packaged good. Actually, during COVID, we didn't go to the toilet more often, so demand for toilet paper pretty much stayed the same. But what we did as consumers, down to behavioral economics, we suffered from fear of loss, myopic loss aversion, and so we tried to panic buy. I don't know if it happened in the US, but in the UK, the supermarkets, who've got really good planning systems, could see this happening, so they just began to ration it, and the problem was over. And actually, they've got such good planning systems, they knew there was enough toilet paper in the system, so no real issue. But and that's what we call dynamic flexibility, which is the ability to be able to flex up or down within your current supply chain configuration. Sometimes you get a shock. So when you talk about PPE or ventilators, that was an unprecedented demand. So let's just be fair. We might have run out of PPE and ventilators, but we have never in our lifetime seen that demand for PPE or ventilators. And when you get a demand like that, what you're then asking for your supply chain is something called structural flexibility. And in order to respond, you need to be able to create a new network design to be able to respond to that new demand pattern. Now, if you want to be structurally flexible, you have to have spare capacity in your network. And I suppose at the time of COVID, because it was difficult to necessarily move things across borders and everybody wanted stuff at the same time, then perhaps it just took time to configure some of those supply chains, then that's perhaps where we saw a lag. But actually, we also saw amazing innovation. I'm sure you saw the same in the US, because someone mentioned earlier, you did have enough PPE after a while. But the same happened in the UK. What we managed to do is to repurpose capacity that we used for other things to make ventilators and to make PPE. And so we created that new network design. And this is where I think I was speaking to some people really smart people from MIT yesterday, but I'm just rubbish with names. I think his name was John.
John,
if
you're out there, shout out to you.
He does amazing stuff around education. It was John. But he was talking about the basic principles of manufacturing strategy. We've forgotten the basic principles of manufacturing strategy, and they will stay in place no matter what we do. And we need to build onto those basic principles of supply chain strategy, the basic principles of supply chain strategy, and remind people what the lean principles really are all about.
All right, very briefly, before we take a couple questions from the audience, I want to come back to both of you, your focus on sustainability. So in this country, and actually in many countries, a lot of the discussion about evolution of supply chain is being driven by national security imperatives. So how do we deal with the fact that China overwhelmingly, is the overwhelming source of cheap solar cells. China is invested heavily in the nickel supply chain in countries like Indonesia and Congo, which is how we're currently making electric vehicles. Does the national security component actually impede the stuff that you both would like to see happen in terms of sustainability, circular economy? Is there a tension there? Go ahead, Alice.
Well, let's see here. Is there a tension in the national security conversation? It's we need to be thinking about how we're evolving supply chains relative to sustainability while we have this opportunity, maybe, as part of that. And I think, so we've looked many times at, what happens as a result of, for example, the China Green Fence Law, when they were, and have continued to limit solid waste imports into China, which means then, what does that mean for what infrastructure we have in the United States to process, scrap materials? And it's not, their best practices, well, I can simplify it. A lot of it comes down to how quickly can we decarbonize the grid, and that's a very obvious statement, but it's true, is that their best practices in China for these manufacturing, but it's driven by coal, and so I think so that's the sort of shifts that we see when we're shifting, manufacturing to and from, or recycling processes to and from other countries is driven by what the carbon intensity of the grid is, which is sort of an obvious finding, but it just further enforces that we need to be thinking carefully about that, in addition to thinking thoughtfully about how to have collaborative activities relative to decarbonizing tough transportation sectors or industry more broadly.
Okay. You got anything you want to add to that?
Not really. The UK created a bit like, I can't remember the name of your project, but we created Project Defend, where they looked at critical materials and the critical supply. I've just seen a call come out for a £6 million grant to create a network that looks at supply chain resilience using complex adaptive systems. So I think we see China as a threat, but in a different way, more from a cybersecurity IP risk. I think we see the issue of supply chain resilience. We're a small island, as I said, with very few resources, as a supply chain resilience issue in a global context, and what we're going to do about that as a sort of broader issue of which China is obviously a part.
Our time is up. Elsa, Jan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it.